Hey everyone! This is hard. I've been wrestling with whether or not to even type this out, to put it into words and make it real, but keeping it bottled up is eating me alive. So here goes. Growing up, my dad, Arthur, was everything to me. He wasn't just my father, he was my role model, my confidant, my hero. I know that sounds cliché, but I mean it with every fiber of my being. He hung the moon for me. My parents split when I was 8. No messy court battles, no screaming matches at least, not that I was aware of. They somehow managed to navigate it with grace, always putting my well-being first. My mom, Evelyn, became my primary caregiver during the week, but weekends? Weekends belonged to Arthur. Those weekends were the highlight of my young life. Friday afternoons couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the school bell rang, I'd bolt out of the building, practically launching myself into his beat-up Ford pickup. The anticipation would build inside me all week, a fizzy excitement that bubbled over the moment I saw his smiling face. Arthur wasn't the type of dad to just stick me in front of the TV while he tinkered in the garage. He made those weekends an adventure. Hiking in the state park, teaching me with infinite patience how to change a tire, building a treehouse in the sprawling oak in his backyard. He even got me hooked on documentaries. We'd sit on the couch, a bowl of popcorn between us, watching stuff about ancient civilizations, the deepest parts of the ocean, or some obscure historical event. He knew I was a sponge for knowledge, and he fed that thirst. And the pride, God, the pride he radiated. It wasn't just about the big achievements, like acing a test or winning the school spelling bee. It was about the little things too, helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries, mastering a new chord on my guitar, even just being kind to a classmate who was getting picked on. He'd look me right in the eyes, those warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and say, "You're my smart, strong girl, Eleanor." Those words were like a shield, protecting me from all the doubts and insecurities that come with growing up. They fueled me. I believed I was smart and strong because he saw it in me. For the longest time, I truly believed nothing could ever shatter that bond. Arthur and I were a team, an unbreakable unit against the world. Then I turned 13, and things started to unravel. That was the year Arthur met Camille. At first, I honestly didn't mind her. She was bubbly, almost relentlessly cheerful, always asking about school, my friends, what books I was reading. She seemed genuinely interested, and that was nice. My mom was great, don't get me wrong, but she wasn't always warm, if that makes sense. Camille had this way of making you feel instantly comfortable, like you'd known her forever. She had 2 kids from a previous marriage, Ethan, who was a year younger than me, and Maisie, who was 10. They seemed fine. Ethan was quiet, a bit awkward, always buried in a video game. Maisie was a total girly girl, obsessed with ballet and glitter and all things pink. They were polite, well-behaved, and for a while, I even entertained the idea that having step-siblings might actually be cool. Then they moved in. That's when the tectonic plates of my world started to shift. Camille quit her job shortly after. Said she wanted to focus on family life. I didn't think much of it at the time. 13-year-olds aren't exactly known for their long-term financial planning skills. But it meant Arthur had to pick up extra shifts at the factory to support everyone. He started coming home later and later, his face etched with exhaustion. And when he was home, all his attention seemed to be laser-focused on Camille and her kids. It was like they were a supernova, sucking all the light and energy in the room. I tried to adjust. I told myself it was just a new family dynamic, and things would settle down eventually. Everyone needs time to find their footing. But the more time that passed, the more I realized that settling down just meant I was slowly becoming invisible. Dinners became a constant barrage of Ethan's baseball games and Maisie's ballet recitals. I try to interject, to share something I was excited about, like the science fair project I'd poured my heart and soul into, and I'd get a polite, That's great, sweetheart, before the conversation abruptly swung back to the logistics of carpools and costume fittings. It wasn't just the small stuff either. Camille's kids always seemed to come first, no matter what. I remember one summer I was really looking forward to visiting my grandparents, Arthur's parents, in Maine. It was a tradition. We did it every year. We would spend a week there with them, go blueberry picking, visit the lighthouse. I loved it, but Camille suggested we go to a theme park instead. Apparently, Maisie had never been to one, and it was her dream. Guess whose plans got scrapped? Yep, mine. No trip to Maine. No blueberry picking. Just a hollow promise that we'll go next year. But next year never came. Things took a nosedive during my junior year of high school. My mom asked me to come over, saying she needed to talk to me about something important. She sat me down at the kitchen table, her face drawn and serious. "There's something you need to know about your college fund," she said, her voice tight. My stomach clenched. I knew, instinctively, that whatever she was about to tell me wasn't going to be good. She explained, her voice trembling slightly, that Arthur had used it. All of it! I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the words. What do you mean, he used it? Apparently, Arthur had drained the fund to pay for Ethan's private school tuition. Camille had convinced him that Ethan was struggling at public school and needed a better environment. So Arthur, without a single word to me, took the money he'd been diligently saving for my future and spent it on her son. Mom only found out because she'd been going through some old paperwork and noticed something was off. She confronted Arthur and he finally admitted what he'd done. She felt I had a right to know, even if it meant shattering my world. I didn't even wait to process it. As soon as Mom finished speaking, I grabbed my phone and dialed Arthur's number. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. He answered, his voice bright and cheerful. Hey, Peanut! What's up? Did you spend my college fund? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. There was a long, pregnant pause. Then he cleared his throat and said, Well, now, Eleanor, let's not get all worked up about this. Is it true, Dad? Did you spend it? I demanded, my voice rising. He sighed. Ethan really needed the support, Peanut. He was falling behind. We'll figure something out for your college. Don't worry. I remember sitting there on the phone, completely floored. Figure something out? I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. That was my college fund, Dad. How could you just spend it without even talking to me? His response was like a punch to the gut. You're smart, Eleanor. You'll be fine. Your mom can help, and I'll pitch in where I can when the time comes. It's not the end of the world. I hung up on him. The tears started flowing, hot and furious, blurring my vision. I cried for hours. Not just for the lost money, but for the lost trust, the lost sense of security, the lost image of the father I thought I knew. Over the next few days, I tried to wrap my head around it. This was the same man who'd always told me I was his number one girl, the same man who promised he'd always have my back. And yet, when it came down to it, he chose Camille's son over me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that he didn't even consider how this would affect me. He didn't consult me, didn't ask my opinion, didn't even give me the courtesy of a warning. He just did it. When I finally talked to him again, he doubled down. He said Ethan was struggling and needed a better school, and that I'd understand someday. But I didn't understand. Not then, and not even now. All I could think about was how incredibly unfair it was. He'd promised me that money was for my education, my future, and now it was gone, sacrificed on the altar of Camille's ambition for her son. A few months later, as if draining my college fund wasn't insult enough, I found out. Arthur had bought Ethan a brand new SUV for his 18th birthday. My stomach dropped when I heard. I couldn't reconcile it. This was the same man who told me he couldn't afford to contribute to my college education. Yet somehow, he had the money to splurge on a luxury car for Camille's son. The hypocrisy was staggering. I saw Ethan driving it around town, a gleaming black behemoth that practically screamed privilege. I doubted that he was struggling. After that, our relationship shifted. I didn't see Arthur the same way anymore. Every time I went to his house, I felt like I didn't belong there. Camille would make little comments, subtle jabs designed to make me feel like an outsider. "Oh, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," she'd say, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. Or, "It's so nice to see you, Eleanor. We were starting to think you'd forgotten all about us." Dinners were always the same. Conversations revolved around Ethan and Maisie, their accomplishments, their struggles, their endless dramas. Any attempt I made to talk about my own life was brushed aside, dismissed with a dismissive wave of the hand. It wasn't just the college fund or the SUV. It was a pattern. Arthur missing my school events because Maisie had a recital, family vacations being planned around their schedules. Every decision he made seemed to prioritize them over me. By the time senior year rolled around, I'd stopped expecting much from him. I still saw him occasionally, but it felt more like an obligation than something I wanted to do. The man who used to make me feel like the most important person in the world had made it abundantly clear where I stood in his new family dynamic, and it wasn't at the center. Not even close. My relationship with Arthur felt more like a chore than anything else. Every visit, every conversation, it all felt forced, like we were just going through the motions. I'd stopped expecting much from him after the whole college fund fiasco, but the way things played out over that year showed me just how far down the totem pole I'd fallen in his life. I didn't cut him off completely, though. I kept visiting on weekends once in a while, mostly because Mom encouraged me. "He's still your father, Eleanor," she'd say. Like that somehow excused everything. But every time I stepped into that house, it felt like I was a guest in someone else's home. Camille and her kids had completely taken over, transforming it into a shrine to their perfect blended family, a family I wasn't a part of. One weekend, I showed up and immediately regretted it the second I walked through the door. Camille started in with, "Oh, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence." She said it with this fake, overly bright smile, but her tone was anything but playful. I just laughed it off, but inside I was fuming. Really? I'm the one making an effort to visit, and that's what I get? Dinner that night was exactly what I expected. Camille spent half the meal talking about how Maisie's dance recital was coming up, and how stressful it was for her to juggle everything. Ethan chimed in about his baseball tryouts, and of course, Arthur was completely engaged, nodding along and asking questions. I sat there, picking at my food, trying to find a moment to jump in and share something about my own life. When I finally mentioned that I'd been accepted to a few colleges, Camille barely let me finish before turning the conversation back to Maisie's rehearsal schedule. Arthur didn't even notice. Or, if he did, he didn't care. I sat there staring at my plate, wondering why I even bothered. It wasn't just the family dinners, though. It was everything. Camille had this way of making me feel like an outsider, without ever being outright rude. Like when she'd plan family outings without even asking if I wanted to join. I'd hear about it after the fact, when Maisie or Ethan would casually mention how much fun they had at the zoo, or the movies, or wherever. One time, I overheard them talking about a camping trip they were planning for the weekend. When I asked Arthur about it, he just shrugged and said, "Oh, I didn't think you'd be interested." Interested? Really? We used to go camping all the time. It was our thing. But now it was like I didn't even exist. The worst part was how normal it all seemed to them. Camille acted like I was some distant relative popping in for an occasional visit, not Arthur's actual daughter. And Arthur just went along with it like this was the way things were supposed to be. I tried talking to him about it once, but he brushed me off. "You're overthinking it, Eleanor," he said. "You've got your own life now. You don't need to be here all the time." Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't need to be there, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. By the time spring rolled around, I'd started to check out emotionally. I still visited occasionally, but I kept my walls up. I'd sit through dinner, nodding and smiling at the right moments, but I wasn't really there. It was like I'd become a spectator in my own family, watching from the sidelines while they went on with their lives. One weekend, I decided to test the waters and see if Arthur even noticed how disconnected I was. I barely said a word during dinner, just nodded along while they talked about Maisie's upcoming recital and Ethan's baseball games. Arthur didn't say anything to me the entire meal. Not one question about school, my college plans, or anything else going on in my life. Camille, of course, filled the silence with her usual chatter about how hard it was to juggle everything with 2 kids. As if I wasn't sitting right there, also his kid. After dinner, I tried to have a one-on-one conversation with Arthur. I asked if we could go for a walk, like we used to. Just the 2 of us. He agreed, but halfway through the walk, while I was about to tell him how I felt left out, Camille called his phone. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but whatever it was urgent enough for him to cut our time short. "Sorry, sweetheart," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "Camille needs me to help with something at home." And that was that. I rarely visited after that. At first, I felt guilty about it, like I was abandoning Arthur. But the truth was, it hurt less to stay away. I focused on school and my own plans instead. I got a part-time job to start saving for college since Arthur's promise of figuring something out was obviously just empty words. Mom tried to help as much as she could, but money was tight. Honestly, Mom was my biggest cheerleader. She wasn't just supportive, she was my rock. Every time I came home feeling invisible or frustrated after a weekend at Arthur's, she was there waiting with a listening ear and my favorite cup of tea. I didn't bring anything happening in my life up to Arthur anymore. What was the point? He was too busy playing super dad to Camille's kids to notice anything I was going through. The final straw came a few weeks before my high school graduation. I'd been hoping, praying, that Arthur would actually show up for this one. It wasn't like I'd asked him for much over the past year. All I wanted was for him to be there to see me walk across that stage and hear my name called. But a week before the ceremony, Camille called me. "Camille, not Arthur." "Hey," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Just wanted to let you know that Arthur won't be able to make it to your graduation. Maisie's dance competition is that same day, and you know how important that is to her." I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there holding the phone, feeling this mix of anger and disbelief. She didn't apologize. She didn't even pretend to care about how I felt. It was just, Maisie's thing is more important. Period. I didn't bother calling Arthur to argue. What was the point? He'd made his choice, just like he always did. And I wasn't expecting much from Arthur anymore. After everything, missing my graduation, draining the college fund, constantly prioritizing Camille's kids, I had lowered my expectations to basically nothing. But even so, his 50th birthday approached, and I still wanted to acknowledge it. It felt like one of those things you just had to do, you know? No matter how distant we'd become, he was still my dad. A week before his birthday, I carefully picked out a gift for him. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a hardback copy of a book about World War II history. I knew he'd love it. He was always a history buff, and we used to talk about that stuff all the time when I was younger. It felt like a safe, thoughtful choice, something that might remind him of the bond we used to have. On the day of his birthday, I decided to swing by his house after work to drop it off. I didn't text or call ahead, because in my mind, this was just a casual visit. I figured we'd chat for a bit, I'd give him the gift, and that would be it. No big deal. But when I pulled into the driveway, I realized something was off. The house was lit up like a Christmas tree, with cars parked all along the street. I could hear music and laughter coming from the backyard. For a second, I thought maybe I'd gotten the date wrong. Maybe I was a week early or something. But no, it was definitely his birthday. I checked my phone just to be sure. I sat in my car, trying to process what I was seeing. It was obvious. This wasn't just a small family gathering. This was a full-blown party. A party for his 50th birthday. And I wasn't even told about it. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Was I really that insignificant in his life now? Part of me wanted to turn around and drive away, just leave the gift on the porch, pretend I never came, and wallow in my misery. But another part of me, maybe the part that still clung to the hope that there was a chance to fix things, decided to go in anyway. I took a deep breath, plastered on a neutral expression, and walked up to the front door. I didn't want to give Camille the satisfaction of seeing me upset. I knocked, and she answered. Her smile froze when she saw me, like she was trying to figure out what I was doing there. "Oh," she said after a beat, her voice laced with a subtle edge. "We didn't know you were coming." I forced a smile and held up the gift. "I just wanted to drop this off for Arthur." "Is he around?" She hesitated for a second, then stepped aside to let me in. "He's in the backyard," she said, gesturing toward the noise. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked through the house, and it took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to turn around and demand to know why I wasn't invited. The backyard was packed. There were string lights everywhere, casting a warm, festive glow over the scene. A catered buffet was set up along one side, laden with all kinds of fancy food I didn't recognize. There was even a DJ in the corner, spinning a mix of classic rock and current pop hits. It looked like something out of a Pinterest board. Arthur was near the grill, laughing with a group of relatives I hadn't seen in years. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who I used to be close to before Camille and her kids took over. He looked up when he saw me and waved me over. "Eleanor." "Hey," he said, pulling me into a quick hug. "I wasn't expecting you." I handed him the gift. "Happy birthday," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He opened it right there and smiled when he saw the book. "Wow, this is great. Thanks, kiddo." For a moment, I almost forgot why I was upset. He seemed genuinely happy to see me, and it reminded me of the Arthur I used to know. The Arthur who loved history, who loved to talk about it with me, who made me feel like my interests mattered. But then the moment passed, and I was standing there, surrounded by people who all knew about this party, people who had been invited, while I was clearly an afterthought. "Did Camille not tell you about the party?" Arthur asked casually, as if this was a minor oversight, easily explained away. "No," I said, trying not to sound as hurt as I felt. "I just came by to drop off your gift. I didn't know there was a party." His face fell for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "Well, I'm glad you're here now. Grab a plate and stick around." But the way he said it didn't feel welcoming. It felt obligatory, like he was trying to smooth things over without actually addressing the problem. I stayed for about 20 minutes, just long enough to make polite small talk with a few relatives and force down a plate of food. Camille kept hovering nearby, watching me like she was afraid I'd cause a scene. I thought about confronting Arthur right then and there, asking him point blank why I wasn't invited. But I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of everyone. I didn't want to give Camille the satisfaction of seeing me lose my cool. When I left, I mumbled a quick goodbye and practically ran to my car. As I drove home, I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, wondering if I'd done something to deserve being left out. Was it because I didn't visit often enough? Because I didn't fit into their perfect little family dynamic? Or was it simply that Camille had successfully poisoned Arthur against me? No matter what the reason was, I knew one thing for sure. I was already an outsider in my own father's life. For days afterward, I felt this heavy weight in my chest. I couldn't focus on school, couldn't concentrate at work. Every time I thought about the party, I felt this mix of anger and sadness that I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just about the party itself. It was about everything that had led up to it. The college fund, Maisie's graduation, the constant favoritism. This party was just another reminder that I wasn't a priority in Arthur's life. I tried to push it aside to tell myself it didn't matter, that I should just let it go and move on. But it did matter. It mattered a lot. I didn't call Arthur after that, and he didn't call me either. Weeks went by, and the silence between us grew louder and louder, a gaping chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. I thought maybe he'd reach out to apologize, to offer some kind of explanation for why I wasn't invited. But he never did. It was like the whole thing never happened, like I hadn't even been there. At some point, I realized I was holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. The Arthur I grew up idolizing, the Arthur who used to make me feel like I was his whole world, was gone. Or maybe he was never really there in the first place, and I was just too young to see it. Either way, it broke something in me. And no matter how much I wanted to fix it, I knew I couldn't do it alone. He had to be willing to meet me halfway. And he clearly wasn't. Then came Maisie's engagement. I found out about it the same way I found out about most things with Arthur's new family, through social media. There it was, plastered all over my feed. A picture of Maisie grinning like a Cheshire cat, showing off an oversized diamond ring on her finger. She was surrounded by a bunch of people I didn't even recognize, probably Camille's side of the family and Maisie's friends from ballet. Arthur and Camille were front and center, of course, looking like proud parents. The caption read, "Can't wait to marry the love of my life. Thanks to my amazing family for making this day so special." At first, I tried to tell myself that maybe the engagement party was something small, thrown together last minute. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I tried not to let the bitterness creep in. But as more pictures started popping up, pictures of the decorations, the catered food, the elaborate cake, it became clear that this wasn't some casual gathering. This was a full-blown event, meticulously planned and flawlessly executed. There was even a freaking photo booth, complete with props and a custom-designed backdrop. And guess who wasn't invited? Again, I didn't call Arthur to ask why. What was the point? He'd either blame Camille, like he always did, or act like it wasn't a big deal. So I stayed quiet, scrolled past the endless stream of happy pictures, and told myself I didn't care. But it was hard not to care when every other day someone I knew was posting pictures from the party. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they were all there, smiling and laughing, like this was the happiest moment in the world. Like everything was perfect, and I was on the outside, looking in. Again! I thought maybe Maisie's wedding itself would be different. Surely I'd get an invitation to that, right? After all, a wedding is a big deal. Even if I wasn't close to Maisie, I was still family. Or at least, I was supposed to be. Weeks passed, and I didn't hear anything. No phone calls, no texts, no invitations in the mail. I checked the mailbox every day, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, one would arrive. I tried to convince myself that maybe they hadn't sent them out yet. Maybe they were waiting until the last minute. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for the silence. But deep down, I knew the truth. Then, one day, I asked a cousin about it. Just a casual, "Hey, are you going to Maisie's wedding?" She looked at me with this strange expression, a mix of pity and awkwardness. "Yeah," she said. "The invites went out weeks ago. I'm sure yours is on the way." She gave me this knowing look, like she knew damn well that wasn't true. A few days later, I got a text from one of my other cousins. It read, "Hey, Maisie wanted me to let you know the wedding is on, date, at, location. Hope you can make it." That was it. No explanation for why I wasn't told sooner. No acknowledgement that I was family. Not even a direct invite from Maisie or Arthur. Just a lazy, secondhand message, passed along like I was their neighbor or something. It didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a formality. Like they knew they had to invite me, but couldn't be bothered to handle it properly. I stared at the text for a long time, trying to figure out how I felt about it. Hurt? Sure. Angry? Definitely. But more than anything, I just felt tired. Tired of always being the afterthought. Tired of trying to force myself into a family that didn't seem to care if I was part of it. For a brief moment, I considered going. Maybe it would keep the peace. Maybe showing up would prove I was the bigger person. Maybe it would finally make them see me. But then I thought about what it would really be like. Sitting in the back row, watching Maisie beam while Arthur gave his toast, probably calling her the daughter he was so proud of, while I sat there, wondering why he couldn't ever say those words about me anymore. I realized I couldn't do it, not because I wanted to make a point, but because I needed to protect myself. Going to that wedding wasn't going to fix anything. It wasn't going to magically make me part of their family. If anything, it would just be another reminder that I was on the outside, looking in. I decided not to go. I didn't announce it to anyone or make a big deal about it. I just quietly made the choice and stuck to it. Of course, Arthur wasn't going to let it slide. A couple of days later, he called me. As soon as I saw his name on the screen, I knew what the conversation was going to be about. I braced myself. "Eleanor," he started, and I could already hear the irritation in his voice. "I just heard from Camille that you're not planning to come to Maisie's wedding. Is that true?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone calm and even. "I decided it's better if I don't." "Better?" he repeated, like the word didn't make sense. "How is that better? She's your stepsister. This is one of the biggest days of her life. And you're just not coming?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Arthur, I don't feel like I'm really wanted there. It's obvious this invitation was sent out of obligation, not because anyone actually cares if I come. I think it's better for everyone if I stay home," he scoffed, and I could picture him shaking his head on the other end of the line. "Not everything has to be about you, Eleanor. This isn't about whether you feel wanted or not. It's about Maisie. This is her big day, and you're making it about your feelings. Can't you put those aside for once?" I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "Arthur, this isn't just about the wedding. It's about everything. The college fund, my graduation, your birthday party, Maisie's engagement party. Do you not see how many times I've been excluded? How many times I've been made to feel like I don't matter? Jesus, Eleanor," he snapped. "You're always so dramatic. Camille has worked so hard to keep this family together, and all you ever do is complain. Maybe if you tried being more supportive, things wouldn't feel so tense." "Supportive?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're telling me to be supportive when I've been left out over and over again? You spent my college fund on Ethan. You missed my graduation for Maisie's recital. You didn't even invite me to your birthday party. And now you're telling me I'm the one who isn't supportive? That's not fair." He paused, and I could hear the guilt creeping into his voice. "You know it's not like that, Eleanor." "Really?" "Because it feels exactly like that," I said, my voice breaking. "It feels like you've chosen Camille and her kids over me. Every single time. And the worst part is, you don't even care how much it's hurt me." There was a long pause. For a moment, I thought he might actually apologize. But instead, he sighed and said, "Look, I don't have time for this. You're either coming to the wedding or you're not. Just know that if you don't, it's going to cause problems. Maisie will be upset. Camille will be upset. And I really don't want to deal with that." "Then don't," I said, my voice sharp. "Deal with your perfect little family and leave me out of it." I hung up before he could respond. The days leading up to the wedding were harder than I expected. I tried to focus on school and work, but my mind kept drifting back to that conversation. I replayed his words over and over, trying to figure out where I went wrong. Was I really being selfish? Dramatic? Was it too much to want to feel like I mattered? On the day of the wedding, I stayed home. I turned off my phone, pulled the blinds, and tried to distract myself with a book. But I couldn't focus. I kept picturing Arthur standing up to give a speech, talking about how proud he was of Maisie, and the thought made my stomach twist into knots. I knew I'd made the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. A few days later, I found out through a cousin that Camille had been bad-mouthing me at the reception. She told anyone who would listen that I was jealous of Maisie and didn't care about family, that I was just a bitter, selfish girl who couldn't stand to see her stepsister happy. It hurt, but honestly, it wasn't surprising. Camille had been painting me as the villain for years. What did surprise me was that some people believed her. I got a couple of texts from extended family members saying they were disappointed in me for missing the wedding, like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. "It was Maisie's day, Eleanor," one aunt wrote. "You should have put your feelings aside and been there for her. Family is important," another uncle texted. "You need to try harder to make this work." I didn't bother replying. I knew there was no point in trying to explain myself to people who had already made up their minds. They only knew Camille's version of the story, and they were perfectly happy to believe it. At that point, I realized I couldn't win. No matter what I did, I'd always be the bad guy in their eyes. If I stood up for myself, I was dramatic. If I stayed quiet, I was unsupportive. And if I walked away, I was selfish. Something had to change. I couldn't keep bending over backward for people who didn't even want me around. I tried to move on after Maisie's wedding. I stopped waiting for calls or texts from Arthur and started focusing on my own life instead. I threw myself into my studies, worked extra hours at my part-time job, and spent more time with my mom and my close friends. I tried to build a life that didn't revolve around Arthur and Camille's drama. But then, a few months later, I found out about another family event through a cousin. This time, it was a backyard barbecue at Arthur and Camille's house. A big one, with extended family invited. Apparently, it was meant to be a celebration for Ethan graduating from college. And as always, I wasn't invited. I'd love to say I was surprised, but at this point, it was just par for the course. Still, hearing about it secondhand stung, especially since Ethan's graduation was apparently such a big deal that they were throwing a full-blown party, while my own high school graduation barely warranted a passing mention. I tried to let it go. What was the point of dwelling on it? It wasn't like anything was going to change. But as the days went by, the anger started bubbling up inside me. Why did they get to keep pretending like I didn't exist? Why did Arthur get to play the role of a proud, devoted parent while completely ignoring the damage he'd done to our relationship? It wasn't like I did something to them that makes them always leave me out. It was just the simple fact that I'm not Camille's kid. I wasn't going to let them get away with it this time. I'd had enough of being pushed aside, of being treated like I was invisible. I wanted to throw everything in their faces, to finally make them acknowledge the pain they'd caused. The day of the barbecue, I got in my car, drove to their house, and walked straight up to the front door. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I just opened the door and stepped inside. The sound of laughter and music spilled out from the backyard, washing over me in a wave of noise. For a moment, I stood there, taking it all in. The house was packed. It seemed like most of the family was there. Relatives I hadn't seen in years. People who hadn't so much as texted me since I graduated high school, but somehow showed up for this celebration. I could hear voices calling out "Congratulations, Ethan," laughter echoing through the walls, the faint clink of glasses. The whole scene felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold, a life that I was supposed to be a part of, but had somehow been excluded from. Camille was the first to notice me. She was walking through the living room with a tray of drinks when she spotted me standing by the door. Her face froze in surprise before twisting into that fake, sugary smile I knew all too well. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said, setting the tray down on the table with a little too much force. "Did you finally remember where your father lives, Eleanor? Or did your mother teach you another trick to get attention?" That hit me like a slap in the face. She had always been passive-aggressive, making subtle digs and snide remarks. But this was different. She wasn't even trying to hide her disdain. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Oh, don't play innocent," she snapped, her smile disappearing altogether. "You've always been like this. selfish, dramatic, just like your mother. She's the one who taught you how to act like the world revolves around you. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself and my mother, but before I could say anything, Arthur walked in from the backyard. His eyes widened when he saw me standing there. "Eleanor? What are you doing here?" "I came to see my family," I said, putting as much emphasis on the word as I could. Camille let out a short, bitter laugh. "Family? That's rich. Coming from someone who skips her stepsister's wedding and can't be bothered to pick up the phone. Always with the theatrics. I've never seen anyone so desperate for attention. It's exhausting. Are you serious right now?" I shot back, my anger starting to boil over. "You didn't even invite me to this party. I found out from a cousin. How many more times are you going to exclude me before you admit that you just don't want me around?" The room went quiet. For a second, I thought Arthur might finally stand up for me, might finally acknowledge the pain I was feeling. But instead, he turned to Camille, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "What's going on is that your daughter decided to barge in and make a scene," Camille said, crossing her arms over her chest. "She's always looking for a way to cause trouble." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Make a scene?" I repeated, my voice incredulous. "I wouldn't have to make a scene if you treated me like I mattered. Instead of constantly putting Ethan and Maisie first." Arthur turned to me, his face hardening. "That's enough, Eleanor. You don't get to come into my house and disrespect my wife like this." "Your wife?" I snapped, the anger finally reaching its breaking point. "She's the one disrespecting me. She's been doing it for years and you just stand there and let her. You pick and choose when you'll be a dad to me, and it's always second to her children." "Don't blame me for your problems," Camille said, her voice dripping with venom. "You've been nothing but a thorn in this family's side since day one. You're bitter because you can't stand that my kids are more successful than you." That did it! I wasn't going to let her rewrite the narrative, to twist the truth to fit her own agenda. I laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed through the suddenly silent room. "You mean Ethan, who had my college fund handed to him on a silver platter? Or Maisie, who's had everything handed to her while I've been busting my ass to get through school? Let's not pretend this is about success. This is about you trying to erase me from my own family." Arthur stepped in then, raising his voice, his face flushed with anger. "Eleanor, stop. You're embarrassing yourself." "No, Arthur," I said, my voice breaking with emotion. "I'm embarrassing you. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You don't like it when I point out the truth. You don't like being reminded of how much you've let me down." His face darkened, and for the first time, I saw just how deep his loyalty to Camille ran. It was like she had completely consumed him, erasing any trace of the man I used to know. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said coldly. "Camille has done more for this family than you ever have. If you can't accept that, then maybe you should get out of here." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. A few family members glanced at each other awkwardly, shifting in their seats. My Aunt Denise, one of the few relatives who had always been kind to me, looked shocked, her mouth slightly open as she leaned closer to whisper something to her husband. "Arthur, that's too far," another relative muttered, just loud enough for me to catch it. Meanwhile, Camille stood behind Arthur, her arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She didn't look surprised by his words. If anything, she looked satisfied, like this was exactly the response she had been waiting for. His words hit me like a slap. They confirmed everything I had suspected for years, that I no longer mattered to him, that he had completely replaced me with Camille and her children. But I refused to let him see how much it hurt. I refused to give him and Camille the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the legal papers I'd been holding on to for months. "Fine," I said, my hand shaking as I shoved the papers into his chest. "If I don't belong here, then you can deal with this." It's a formal claim for the college fund you stole from me. Maybe Ethan's private school and his shiny new SUV were worth it. But I'm not letting you get away with it anymore." The room went silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I refused to meet their gaze. Camille's mouth opened and closed like a fish, her carefully constructed facade finally cracking. Arthur just stared at the papers in his hands, his face pale and stricken. "You want to talk about family?" I said, my voice rising, fueled by years of pent-up anger and resentment. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't treat their own like strangers. You've been nothing but a puppet for Camille, and I'm done pretending otherwise. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out the door. I could feel the weight of their stares on my back, but I kept walking, refusing to let them see me falter. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of voices rising as the chaos I'd caused sank in. I imagined Camille launching into a tirade, blaming me for everything, and Arthur meekly apologizing for my behavior. But I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd taken control of the situation, instead of letting it control me. I'd finally stood up for myself, and that felt liberating. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. I had said my piece, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something I'd been holding on to for far too long. The end of the hope that Arthur and I could ever have the kind of relationship we used to have. The end of the illusion that he still cared about me. 2 weeks after the barbecue, Arthur finally reached out. I let the call go to voicemail, knowing exactly what it would be about. His message was exactly what I expected, full of anger and blame, completely devoid of any self-awareness. "Eleanor, I can't believe you're doing this," he said, his voice dripping with frustration. "You're really going to drag this family into legal drama over some money? Ethan needed that school, and you've had plenty of opportunities to figure out your own way. I can't believe you'd stoop this low." I deleted the voicemail without replying. What was there to say? He didn't even try to understand my perspective or take responsibility for his actions. In his eyes, I was the villain, and Camille was probably fanning the flames, making sure he stayed angry at me. A week later, I received a letter from Arthur's lawyer. He was contesting my claim, arguing that the college fund had always been family money, and that he had the right to use it as he saw fit. He claimed that I was being greedy and vindictive, and that I was trying to ruin his life. It felt horrible, but I wasn't surprised. If there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that Arthur would do anything to avoid admitting he was wrong. He would twist the truth, rewrite history, and blame everyone else, just to avoid taking responsibility for his own actions. My lawyer thankfully was prepared. We had documentation proving the fund was specifically set up for my education, including old bank statements with my name listed as the beneficiary. We also had copies of emails and letters from Arthur, explicitly stating that the money was intended for my college expenses. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about holding him accountable for years of broken promises, of constant favoritism, of emotional neglect. It was about showing him that he couldn't just walk all over me and expect me to stay silent. The legal process dragged on for months. During that time, Arthur's calls became less frequent, and when he did reach out, it was never to apologize. Instead, he accused me of tearing the family apart, of causing unnecessary drama, and of putting everyone in an uncomfortable position. Camille, of course, wasn't subtle about her disdain. She took to social media, posting vague but clearly targeted comments about ungrateful people who think they're entitled to everything, and about the importance of loyalty and family values. Meanwhile, extended family members started taking sides. Some reached out to show their support, telling me they'd seen how unfairly I'd been treated for years, and that they admired my courage for standing up for myself. Others sided with Arthur, claiming I was being unreasonable, and that I should just let it go. One aunt even called me, her voice filled with disappointment. "It's just money, Eleanor," she said. Is it really worth ruining your relationship with your father over money? But it wasn't just money. It was my future, my trust, my dignity. All things Arthur had trampled on without a second thought. I was done pretending that wasn't the case. When the case finally went to mediation, the evidence was airtight. Arthur's lawyer tried to argue that the money was needed for a pressing family emergency, and that Ethan's education was an investment in his future, but the mediator wasn't buying it. Every excuse Arthur tried to offer was met with hard evidence to the contrary. At one point, he actually had the nerve to say, "I always thought Eleanor was smart enough to figure out college without the fund. She didn't need it as much as Ethan did." The mediator shut him down immediately, pointing out that the fund wasn't his to decide how to use. It was set up for me, and using it for anything else, especially without my consent, was a clear breach of trust. In the end, Arthur agreed to settle. He didn't apologize or even look at me as the terms were finalized. He just signed the papers, his face a mask of resentment and bitterness. The agreement required him to repay a significant portion of the fund over the next few years, but the money wasn't what mattered most to me. It was the fact that, for once, he couldn't just sweep his actions under the rug and pretend I didn't exist. It was about making him acknowledge the pain he had caused, even if he would never admit it out loud. The fallout was immediate. Arthur stopped calling altogether. Camille ramped up her social media campaign, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who had ruined the family and who only cared about money. Extended family members whispered about the situation at gatherings I didn't attend, and the few relatives who did reach out to me seemed hesitant, like they didn't want to be caught in the middle. It was messy. It was exhausting, but it was also freeing, in a strange way. For years, I had bent over backward to maintain a relationship with Arthur, convincing myself that if I just tried harder, things would get better. But the legal battle made it clear that I wasn't the problem. He was. He was unwilling to change, to acknowledge his mistakes, or to treat me with the respect I deserved. I'd like to say that was the end of it, but of course, Camille couldn't let it go. A few months later, she sent me a scathing email, accusing me of disrespecting her family, of trying to tear them apart, and of being a spoiled brat who only cared about money. She even had the audacity to suggest that I pay back the money Arthur was ordered to return, since you're the one who made such a big deal about it in the first place. I didn't respond. I deleted the email and blocked her address. I refused to engage in her toxicity any longer. As for Arthur, I haven't heard from him since the mediation. Part of me wonders if he'll ever try to reach out, to apologize or to explain, but I'm not holding my breath. If he does, it'll probably be another attempt to shift the blame onto me, or to demand that I fix the relationship. But I've made peace with the fact that I don't owe him anything. Not my time, not my forgiveness, and definitely not my silence. This chapter of my life is over. I'm moving on, focusing on building a future for myself, surrounded by people who love and support me for who I am. People who don't make me feel like I have to earn their affection. People who value my presence in their lives. It's not the family I always imagined, but it's the family I choose. And that's enough.